We will hear, and I will say a little bit about each one. First from Christian Heimberger. He's one of the volume editors of the document series, which this, of course, is Documents Volume 5, October 1835 to January 1838. Someone suggested that perhaps the lighter crowd tonight is there might be Joseph Smith Papers fatigue. There are a lot of volumes out, and there will be a lot more. Each one is unique, of course, and important, and this one is as exciting as any that we've had. Christian holds a BA in American Studies from BYU and a PhD in Modern American History from the University of Colorado Boulder. He was previously an adjunct professor at Utah Valley University, which, unless I'm mistaken, does that have a bigger enrollment than BYU now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Used to be Utah Technical College. It's come a long way. Visiting scholar BYU, and he's got quite a vitae, and so I'm not going to go into everything. Elizabeth Keene is another one of the volume editors, and earned a BA with honors in history and classical language certificate from ASU, an MA in European women's history from Purdue, currently a PhD candidate in early modern European history at the University of California, Irvine. Previously, she was an instructor in the History Department and Religious Studies program at that same university. And so Christian will be first, and then Elizabeth, and batting cleanup will be Max Parkin, who I'm sure you all know. He received a BS in business from the University of Utah, an MA from BYU in history and philosophy of religion, and his PhD also from BYU in LDS church history and doctrine. Some of his writings include The Conflict at Kirtland, Sacred Places, Missouri, countless articles, and taught in the church educational system for 50 years, principally the Institute at the U. I've known Max for many years and have long admired him for his candor, but his professionalism. He is a consummate scholar and a gentleman, and highly respected in the field. Alex Baugh and Steve Harper, as I mentioned, can't be with us tonight. I won't go into their credentials, but they wanted to be here, but unfortunately could not. So let's go in that order, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, now let me get you hooked up here. If we can just test that out.
Works. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, can I steal those back?
Sorry, what did I take? I took yours instead of mine.
I'll give you this one.
There we go. I was just wondering if you'd catch it.
Well, would have sooner or later. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. It's a pleasure for us to be here, to be able to introduce some of the insights that we've been able to glean from Joseph Smith Papers, specifically from Documents Volume 5. It's my task to give you a little bit of a volume overview before I launch into my own remarks. Documents Volume 5 covers a period from October 1835 through January 1838. I tried to think of a real succinct way of encapsulating what's in the volume. I think the thing I would say is that it examines both the zenith and the nadir of Mormon experiences in Kirtland, including the dedication of the Kirtland Temple as well as dissent in Kirtland. The volume features 118 documents that are associated with Joseph Smith, including 28 letters to and from Joseph Smith, 24 minutes of meetings in which Joseph Smith participated, 16 Revelations, 3 Blessings, editorial content from the Elders Journal, as well as myriad financial documents, including powers of attorney, promissory notes, land deeds, and a temple mortgage. So that's kind of a broad overview of the documents that are contained. Some of the notable documents in the volume that you may be interested in, there's 6 canonized revelations, including D&C 108 through 112, as well as D&C 137. We have the second first vision account that Joseph Smith wrote in his journal that's about to Robert Matthews, who was a visitor to Kirtland. We have the Egyptian Language Project, or at least the early Egyptian Language Project, which would include the Book of Abraham, the manuscript from that, as well as the Egyptian alphabet. Minutes and prayer of the Kirtland Temple dedication, a letter to Oliver Cowdery that's related to abolitionism, which I'll address here shortly. Articles of agreement from the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company. So we will talk about that as well tonight. There are many documents that address dissent in Kirtland. There's a letter of recommendation for Heber C. Kimball as he becomes the first to lead a group to England, the first mission to England. We also have a really fascinating hand-drawn map of the plat of Kirtland City that you can see in the pages as well. So what I thought I would do is just cover 2 documents tonight that I found interesting, that I thought you might find interesting as well. They're both letters. So in the early winter of 1835-1836, Joseph Smith and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles had a problem. During a session of the Kirtland Debating School, which was one of many educational programs then operating in the bustling town, 2 participants had gotten into an especially heated debate. Verbal sparring eventually led to a physical confrontation that left one of the men, quote, unable to sit down or rise up without help. News of the scuffle reverberated through Kirtland, and within 24 hours, the 12 had summoned one of the men to a council to account for his behavior. While it wasn't uncommon for men of the age to settle their differences in a wrestling match or a fist fight or even an armed duel, this particular fight was perhaps slightly unusual in that one of the men was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and the other was revered by many of his followers as a prophet of God. Who are the young men, you might ask? You may have guessed already. It was Joseph Smith and his younger brother, William. So Joseph was the one who took the beating on this occasion, and according to his journal, he spent the following day at home feeling, quote, quite unwell. Joseph's parents visited him at home and were reportedly sorely afflicted in mind on account of the fight. Hiram, who sided with Joseph, expressed that he was, quote, wounded to the very soul with the conduct of William. William, as I mentioned, was called before his fellow apostles to account for his behavior, and shortly after penned a very penitent letter to his older brother. Joseph then responded with his own poignant letter. So both of these letters are featured in Part 2 of Documents, Volume 5. And I would say that while there are a lot of documents in this volume that highlight Joseph Smith as a prophet, including, as I mentioned, 16 revelations, I'm rather fond of these letters because they give us a better sense of Joseph Smith the man. So though he was head of a growing religious movement, Joseph Smith was only 29 years old in 1835. I think it's important to keep that in mind. William Smith, who had been recently ordained an apostle, was only 24. William later recalled that in his youth he was, quote, quite wild and inconsiderate, paying no attention to religion of any kind, for which I received frequent lectures from my mother and from my brother, Joseph. The brothers' relationship began to sour in the fall of 1835. During a disciplinary council for David and Mary Elliott, Joseph and William engaged in a heated debate over a deposition that was offered by their mother, Lucy Mack Smith. The dispute was revisited several days later at Joseph's home, and according to Joseph Smith's journal, William insisted that, quote, he had not done wrong, and that Joseph was always determined to carry his points, whether right or wrong. When Hiram then interceded in this debate, William reportedly became agitated. His passion increased, the entry continued, and he rose abruptly and declared that he wanted no more to do with us, or the church, and said that we might take his license, for he would have nothing to do with us. Shortly after, William decided to go out and publicly speak against his older brother. By all appearances, the two brothers had reconciled before winter, but the episode at the debating school on December 16th clearly reignited lingering tensions. Verbal sparring became physical, and before Joseph could remove his jacket, William was on him. The exact nature of Joseph Smith's injuries on this occasion are unclear, but historian Andrew Jensen later asserted that those injuries remained with him throughout the rest of his life. In the opening line of his letter to Joseph, William wrote, quote, "Brother Joseph, though I do not know I have forfeited all right and title to the word brother in consequence of what I have done, for I consider myself unworthy to be called one." Informing Joseph that he had asked the 12 to appoint someone else to that body, he begged his brother to, quote, "have mercy on me and let me remain as a member of the church." In his reply, Joseph explained his side of the story, including why he had felt compelled to reprove his brother during the debate. He then described his feelings about his brother's attack. Quote, "After having been rescued from your grasp, I left your house with feelings that were indescribable. The scenery had changed, and all those expectations that I had cherished when going to your house of brotherly kindness, charity, forbearance, and natural affection that in duty binds us. But alas, abuse, anger, malice, hatred, and rage with marks of violence heaped upon my body by a brother were the reflections of my disappointment." Joseph continued, "In your letter you asked my forgiveness, which I readily grant. Grant me the privilege of saying that however hasty or harsh I had spoken at any time to you, it has been done for the express purpose of endeavoring to warn, exhort, admonish, and rescue you from falling into difficulties and sorrows." So the fight and its their eventual reconciliation with William was really synecdoche for the various ways in which Joseph urged church members, including members of the 12, to put aside their petty jealousies and divisions so that they would be spiritually prepared to receive the long promised endowment of power in the house of the Lord, which would happen several months later. Joseph Smith's efforts to reprove and to unify and eventually sanctify church members is a theme that permeates many of the documents that you'll find in the first quarter of Documents, Volume 5. Another one of my favorite documents in this volume relates to an issue that would really become the center of a great national debate in the 1830s and would continue to be a touchstone for controversy for another 30 years, and that's of slavery. On April 9th, 1836, Joseph wrote a letter to Oliver Cowdery, who was then editor of the church publication Messenger and Advocate, in which he stated his views on the rights of citizens of the United States to own slaves, and he addressed the spread of abolitionism in Ohio. The letter itself was prompted by a recent abolitionist lecture that was delivered in Kirtland, but Joseph Smith's reaction to that event was shaped by both contemporary and historical events. So, though Americans had been debating the morality of slavery since before the founding of the nation, the 1830s saw the rise of new ideas and rhetoric that would really shape, or reshape rather, the national discourse. Distancing themselves from those who advocated the recolonization of slaves to Africa or of gradual emancipation, abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison condemned slavery on moral grounds and demanded that there should be immediate emancipation and enfranchisement for black slaves. So using very public speeches and his polemical newspaper, The Liberator, as a vehicle, Garrison sought to, quote, lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation. In December of 1833, Garrison joined other prominent abolitionists to found the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was an organization that advocated the immediate abandonment of slavery without expatriation. By the mid-1830s, abolitionists had organized hundreds of anti-slavery societies in communities across the country, and over 100 in Ohio alone. This was by far the most of any state in the country. Ohio thus had become a hotbed of abolitionism during the 1830s and really attracted a vocal group of students and professors to local religious institutions that included Hudson's, Western Reserve College, and Oberlin College, both of which were situated less than 50 miles from Kirtland. So responding to an abolitionist lecture given by Oberlin student John Alvord, Joseph Smith's letter to Cowdery demonstrates the way in which Joseph Smith attempted to balance a contentious national issue with the needs of a burgeoning, though often scorned, religious movement. In his letter to Cowdery, Joseph Smith distances himself, and by implication the church, from the tenets of abolitionism. Without explicitly advocating a position on the biblical justifications of slavery, he tacitly uses those teachings to argue that, quote, the people of the North do not have any more right to say that the South shall not hold slaves than the South shall say to the North that they shall. Considering that some former slaves or free blacks were actually baptized into the church, and at least 2 that we know of were ordained to the priesthood during Joseph Smith's lifetime, this letter offers a rare glimpse into how Joseph Smith navigated complex issues surrounding race, slavery, and even religious liberty. In the years to come, many religious denominations would fracture along a north-south line, and Joseph, therefore, is walking a very delicate line as he led this fledgling Mormon church. This is one of the places in the volume where we try to place Joseph Smith and the church's history into a larger a larger cultural milieu of 19th century America. Joseph Smith's letter was shaped by a number of factors, including the nation's perception of radical abolitionism in the mid-1830s, as well as the saints' own experiences in Missouri. While many 20th century Americans rightly see those who sought to free slaves in the mid-19th century as heroes, the ideology and the tactics of the abolitionists in the mid-1830s were seen by most Americans as radical, not only in the South, but in the North as well. After abolitionists began to mail anti-slavery literature en masse to members of Congress and to prominent citizens in the South in 1834 and 1835, mobs then ransacked post offices, burned abolitionist materials, and hanged prominent abolitionists like Garrison in effigy. While Northerners largely condemned Southern slavery, most remained indifferent, if not opposed, to radical abolitionism. Indeed, from 1834 to 1835, anti-abolitionist riots broke out in cities across the region, including in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati. The pervasiveness of anti-abolitionist violence meant Mormon leaders were keenly aware that if they so much as hinted at support for abolitionism, there could be violent repercussions. As I mentioned, the experiences of Latter-day Saints in Jackson County, Missouri in 1833 also shaped the way in which Joseph Smith and other church leaders responded to the spread of abolitionism around Kirtland. Several years earlier, residents of Jackson County had accused Mormon settlers of, quote, tampering with our slaves and endeavoring to sow dissensions and raise seditions among them. 2 days later, a mob destroyed the church's printing shop and tarred and feathered 2 local leaders. The perception that the church supported the migration of free blacks to Missouri ultimately contributed to their mass expulsion from the county. Violent opposition and traumatic uprooting undoubtedly made Mormon leaders weary of outwardly associating themselves with the already controversial abolitionist doctrines. Now, in later years, of course, Joseph Smith expressed a progressive view of the intellectual capacities of black slaves, and even advocated giving them civil rights and ultimately emancipation during his presidential campaign in 1844. But this was a different context, and the 1836 letter, I think, can offer insight into Joseph Smith's evolving views on race and on abolitionism, and demonstrates the ways in which the Latter-day Saints participated in a larger conversation about slavery in America. And I will pass the mic on to Elizabeth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, we'll go with that. So in contrast to the 2 documents that Christian highlighted, I'll be touching on 2 prominent themes that are found throughout the second half of Documents Volume 5. And as boring as they may seem, and as much as historians sometimes prefer to ignore them, Joseph Smith's financial records proved critical in understanding the period from fall 1836 to his departure from Kirtland in January 1838. With the completion and dedication of the temple, the focus of Joseph Smith and other Kirtland church leaders became resolving the debts that they had incurred building the Kirtland Temple, and building Kirtland as a gathering place for the Latter-day Saints. To accomplish these objectives, in the fall of 1836, Joseph Smith became involved in several financial ventures. He opened at least 1 mercantile store, purchased upwards of 400 acres of land in the Kirtland area, and with other church members decided to establish a local bank. This bank, initially called the Kirtland Safety Society Bank, is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the Kirtland era of Mormon history. It has served as an easy shorthand for the difficulties of 1837, and ultimately been blamed for Joseph Smith leaving Kirtland, but the history of the institution is of course more complex. The Kirtland Safety Society was an ambitious endeavor and relatively short-lived. The initial plans for the bank came together in October 1836, and on November 2nd, stockholders approved the bank's constitution and elected Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith as the bank's officers. The fact that the society began in 1836 is sometimes overlooked in broad generalizations about Kirtland, but this context is critical to understanding the impetus for the bank. 1836 was a year of growth and prosperity in both Kirtland and the United States more generally. Warren Cowdery, acting as editor of the Kirtland newspaper The Messenger and Advocate, portrayed this as a happy time of industry with the sounds of workmen's hammers ringing through the streets. This period of prosperity led thousands of individuals throughout the nation to take financial risks, to speculate in land, cotton, or other markets, and to overextend their credit under the assumption that such prosperity would continue and they would be able to repay what they had borrowed. While we sometimes look back with hindsight and condemn the Kirtland Safety Society as a failure from the beginning, there was no indication for church members in 1836 that this would become one of the worst times to start a new bank. Nor was it as desperate or foolish an endeavor as it has sometimes been portrayed. Small frontier banks were a common feature in 19th century America. Banks allowed illiquid assets like land, the only real asset the church had in Kirtland, to be used as collateral for loans, providing money the church and its members needed to build land, to buy land, build homes, and aid church members in Missouri. Although organized in the fall of 1836, the society did not begin operating in office until early January 1837, after the institution had been restructured and was given the somewhat cumbersome name of Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. From that point on, the Safety Society struggled with solvency and legitimacy, facing funding problems, a lack of Mormon investment, and considerable external opposition. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon resigned their positions as officers by early July 1837, and by August, the Kirtland Safety Society had failed. No single factor led to the demise of the society. There were problems in its financial organization. Its credibility and solvency were questioned. Its sustainability was limited by its lack of funding, lack of a bank charter, religious prejudice, and antagonistic litigation. Ultimately, the bank collapsed due to the economic upheaval created by the nationwide financial panic, sometimes referred to as the Panic of 1837, which resulted in banks across the nation failing, land values falling, and debts being called in by creditors. This panic would lead to a devastating economic depression that would last well into the 1840s. The bank was not the catastrophic financial disaster it has sometimes been portrayed as. While many in Kirtland experienced some financial loss as a result of the bank failing, it did not single-handedly destroy the Kirtland economy. The community's economy and individual church members' finances were far more drastically affected by the economic downturn of the financial panic and plummeting land values. The society had few stockholders, and for most, their losses were minimal. The largest losses related to the society's notes, which had significantly depreciated in value and were not accepted by most banks. However, the bank did act as a catalyst for lingering doubts about Joseph Smith and his leadership. Although Smith's involvement in temporal matters was a point of dispute, the dissenters also expressed doubts about his prophecies and the direction in which he was leading the church. In sermons throughout the winter of 1836 and 1837, church members in Kirtland were counseled to stop speaking against the church president. By May 1837, individual dissenters raised allegations of speculation and lying. Apostles Parley P. Pratt and John F. Boynton directed their anger and sense of betrayal specifically at the bank. Pratt faced the threat of losing his land and home because of economic difficulties and lashed out at Joseph Smith in a 23 May letter for leaving his debt to Joseph, quote, to the mercy of the bank, notwithstanding the most sacred promise on your part that I should not be injured by this transaction. In a September 3, 1837 meeting, Boynton argued that he had lost his testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet because the bank which he believed had been founded by revelation had failed. The fault here is less the bank and more doubts about Joseph Smith's prophecies. The members who became dissenters in the summer of 1837 argued that they had been led astray and that Smith was a false or fallen prophet. He had told them to invest in Kirtland, and the result in 1837 for many were financial difficulties. The core of the dissenters' betrayal was not solely the bank, but that a man that they believed to be a prophet had not warned them of impending financial danger, and that the church's banking company had brought financial loss, not success. Their reasons for doubt were understandable, and some seemed tied to the expectations that required perfection of a prophet. Facing the reality of Smith's imperfection and the possibility that not every church venture would succeed, they stumbled. Some, like Boynton, blatantly said they'd lost their faith. A few, like Warren Parrish, became fierce opponents, actively working to discredit and malign Joseph Smith. Others were able to reconcile the apparent imperfections and chose to continue to follow the prophet. And on this spectrum of reactions, many church members probably fell in this space in between complete acceptance or rejection. The question the saints faced in 1837 was whether they would follow a prophet who would not always succeed, who would make mistakes, and who might require financial loss, failure, or suffering in order to achieve the commandments of God. But the sense of betrayal cut multiple ways. While the dissenters had legitimate reasons for feeling betrayed, so too did Joseph Smith. He had worked to build a place of safety and strength for the saints, and he was met with disunity, financial failure, and close friends denouncing him as a false prophet. Joseph took 4 lengthy trips in 1837, in February, April, August, and October, respectively, and with each trip, dissent escalated during his absence. Dissension, division, and disunity were a constant reality for the Kirtland community throughout 1837 and into early 1838. There were moments when opposition peaked and others when it seemed to quell for a time, but it never entirely dissipated, even after the Kirtland High Council excommunicated 28 dissenters in late December 1837. This tension took a heavy emotional toll, both on Joseph Smith as well as the entire church community. The religious community that had been united in completing and dedicating a temple in March of 1836 was deeply divided by January 1838. And yet, even with the possibility of violent reprisals for remaining loyal to Joseph Smith, some members longed for their earlier unity to be restored and the dissenters to return to the fold. Writing in January 1838, Blake Kimball noted her distress about the excommunicated dissenters. Quote, "Now after all that I have said about this dissenting party, there is some of them that I love, and have great feeling and pity for them. I know that they have been tried to the very quick, and what grieves me the most of all is that many things which they tell, I have no doubt but what are too true. Still I do not think they are justifiable in the course they have taken." Max, I'll turn it over to you.
Just clip on that.
Yeah, it does.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you this evening, brothers and sisters, and to address 3 topics. One is about the United Firm, which I hope the Latter-day Saints will be informed as a result of these documents in a way that they will begin to stop talking about the United Order as they normally do, or in the way they normally do. The second topic is I want to say something about abolition also, a brief comment about that. And then thirdly, I want to speak about the 3 missing Kirtland revelations, which were thought to be missing, but later were discovered and now are in these volumes. In order to begin a review of the United Firm, I want to give a little bit of historical background. Although Volume 5 deals with the later documents of the Kirtland period, I want to go back to 1831, February. Joseph has just arrived in Kirtland from New York. The Saints are now finding a new home in Kirtland, Ohio, leaving their homesteads in New York. Joseph had 3 concerns when he arrived at Kirtland that spring, winter and then that spring. One concern was he was very much concerned about getting his revelations published. Another concern was he knew by this time that there was going to be a Zion, a new city of God, but he didn't know where it was. And the third concern was he didn't know how he was going to pay for it or finance his endeavor in building the New Jerusalem. So in the spring of, early spring, midsummer actually, Joseph went to Missouri with a troop of missionaries, identified Zion as Jackson County, Missouri, dedicated the temple lot, and then assigned brethren to administer the affairs in Zion, independent of Jackson County. He returned to Kirtland. Over the next year or so, the church acquired several properties, and these properties became a great concern to the church. However, before they did, in order to build these properties and to acquire them, Joseph introduced the solution to the problem as to how he is going to finance Zion. Now that is a big problem. How are you going to pay for it? And the Lord gave him a revelation in Doctrine and Covenants section 42, which gave him the idea and the program for what we know of as the law of consecration and stewardship. The idea was that the saints who would gather to Missouri would consecrate their assets, sell their farms wherever they were, take that property or money to Missouri, and then consecrate their property to the bishop of the church, Edward Partridge, in Independence. And that way they would eventually have a surplus. They would buy land. The bishop would buy land, would establish communities in Jackson County, and eventually they would have, as I say, surplus and more consecrations, and that's the way they would pay for the whole project of building Zion, the New Jerusalem, in Jackson County, there at Independence. The program, of course, did not succeed. It did enough for Bishop Partridge to acquire funds enough to buy land to begin the nucleus for 5 settlements in Jackson County, one at Independence and then 4 others farther out in the west of Independence in the county, just before the Indian border, which was only 8 miles away. But generally speaking, there was problems, and Partridge had to face those difficulties because he was in charge of this endeavor in Independence. Well, as I say, the program did not succeed, or did not succeed well. When the saints were driven out of Jackson County into Clay County, they never implemented consecration and stewardship. And then 2 years later, after being driven out of Clay County in Caldwell County at far west, they did not aggressively implement consecration and stewardship there either. Consequently, the Lord gave to Joseph Smith an alternate financial program to finance whatever the cause of Zion might be, and that was the law of tithing. Consecration and stewardship, however, did not die in the church. The prophet Joseph later implemented consecration and stewardship into the temple endowment, so that the more robust, the more faithful, the more committed Latter-day Saints then would be the ones challenged and committed to apply the principles of consecration and stewardship. And down to today, a Latter-day Saint can live the consecration and stewardship principles as well as they ever could in the history of the church, and in some ways maybe even better. It's a live program. In the spring of 1832, by this time the church had acquired a number of properties, and Joseph was concerned about managing those properties. In Kirtland, he was given a revelation from the Lord to gather the leaders in Kirtland, that is Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Bishop Newell K. Whitney, to go out to Independence, Missouri, to meet with the brethren there and to establish some kind of a financial program to manage the church's properties. In April of 1832, the brethren met in Independence and proceeded to organize that new management firm. It was called the United Firm, because they're uniting the store, N.K. Whitney Company in Kirtland, with Gilbert and Whitney Company store in Independence. And they're also going to unite other properties of the church. For instance, in Kirtland, they had the Newell K. Whitney store. The church had purchased a farm from Peter French, a very large farm, and also acquired by consecration a farm from Frederick G. Williams. And those two farms were large enough to occupy or to compose the entire western half of the new Mormon city of Kirtland. So those properties were owned, plus some other smaller lots in Kirtland, as well, of course, as the Whitney store. In Missouri, there was the Gilbert and Whitney store. There was also the church printing house in Independence. There were the properties of the 5 Mormon settlements in Jackson County, and other kinds of properties. And so these brethren and the leaders in Kirtland, now in Missouri, and the leaders in Missouri, Edward Partridge, Gilbert, W.W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery was there, and John Whitmer. These brethren then arranged for a new united firm as a management company to direct the affairs of the church's assets, properties, and businesses. They appointed altogether about 10 men at this time to manage that organization. Later on they'll add 2 more. We might call them a board of directors. This board of directors, or this management body then, would manage, direct the affairs of the properties of the church. That was the united firm. Well, like consecration and stewardship, it did not succeed well, and in 2 years it was so much in debt that the prophet Joseph received a revelation, section 104, to cancel out or to retire the united firm and to transfer the properties back to the original owners. Incidentally, the united firm as an entity never owned any properties or any assets. They were always held in the original owner's name and continued on that way, and then transferred back to those original owners when the united firm discontinued, which it did in 1834. Now those events and those revelations are all described and discussed in volume 2 of the documents and volume 4 of the documents. The reason I'm bringing up the subject here is because there is a document, a blessing given by the prophet Joseph Smith to Newell K. Whitney in Kirtland, and although the blessing does not mention the united firm, the introduction does several times, inasmuch as Newell K. Whitney was the agent of the united firm in Kirtland. Gilbert was the agent of the united firm in Jackson County. And so because this is the last time we'll be talking about or seeing any reference to the united firm in the documents, I presume, I want to bring up the subject. Now, the united firm, though it's discontinued by section 104 of the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Revelations and in the Joseph Smith Papers volumes, whenever there's a document about the united firm, etc., they are always giving reference to the united firm, which they do in letters, which they do in minutes of meetings. It's always the united firm. However, in 1835, the prophet Joseph finally got his scriptures, his revelations published in the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants at Kirtland. They tried, of course, in Missouri. As you know, that press was destroyed. But in Kirtland, they established the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, and Joseph was concerned about the half a dozen revelations about the united firm, because this was a revealed program under the direction of the Lord, under the direction of this body of Latter-day Saint leaders. The Lord was concerned, well, Joseph was concerned at least, that if those revelations about the united firm were published in the Doctrine and Covenants, that would create perhaps source material for the church's attorneys or the church's complainants, those who were taking the church to court for debt, might use those revelations as evidence in their cases. So the prophet Joseph reasoned, we will publish those half a dozen or so revelations about the united firm in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, but will do so only if we can disguise the participants in the revelations. There were about 25 different code names then that replaced the names that were in the revelations. Names of the brethren I've mentioned, the leaders in Missouri, the leaders in Kirtland, and the name of the city, Kirtland, the name of things like money, the names of various kinds of activities of the United Firm, including changing the name of the United Firm to read United Order. Joseph also adjusted and changed several other passages in the Revelations to moderate them in such a way that didn't create a problem for the church. Orson Pratt called these names fictitious names. We all know, of course, of them. They were in the original edition. They began in 1876 to be removed slowly. The problem was no longer present. And finally, in 1981 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, all names were removed. That is, all of the fictitious names were removed, and the original names were placed in the Doctrine and Covenants in their place, except one word, one name. And that's the name of the firm. The name of the firm, United Firm, no longer appears in the Revelations, but rather the substitute or fictitious name appeared, the United Order. One might say, well, what difference does it make if it's called United Firm or United Order? And I think there's a bearing on what we believe there. For example, to illustrate the point, in our Sunday school in recent years, somebody raised their hand and spoke to the teacher and made some comment like this: well, when you get to the celestial kingdom, when we live the United Order, things will all be better. Well, that person and most other Latter-day Saints are not aware that the United Order is simply a business management firm designed to direct the affairs of the assets of the church in 1832 to 34. They have nothing to do with heaven, or little to do with heaven, any more than any other kind of business or activity might have a relationship there. So consequently, the word United Order seems to carry with it a little baggage, some kind of a sense of supernatural or special or angelic or heavenly program. I think that needs to be corrected so that we understand what the United Firm indeed was. And finally, in the 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, the church began to give us some counsel about what the United Order indeed, in reality, was. I'd like to read to you just a couple of entries from the introduction of section 78, which was the revelation given to Joseph in Kirtland to gather up the brethren and go out to Missouri and meet with the brethren there and organize this United Mercantile Publishing Endeavor firm. And in this revelation, the introduction mentions now for the first time in our Doctrine and Covenants literature that the United Order was indeed the United Firm. However, the church has continued to leave the term order or United Order in the revelation. Then I want to turn next to section 82, which was the revelation Joseph received in Independence, Missouri in 1832 when he organized the United Firm. This is the introduction to section 82. This revelation reiterates instructions given in an earlier revelation, section 78, to establish a firm known as the United Firm under Joseph Smith's direction to govern the church's mercantile and publishing endeavors. And then, of course, throughout that revelation, the church has left the terminology order or United Order or everlasting order in the text of the Doctrine and Covenants. However, when you do turn to the Joseph Smith Papers and read those same documents in the Joseph Smith Papers, you'll see that the original text read United Firm. I'll say then, just in passing, one final thing, and that is there never was a united order in this church in Missouri and Ohio. Didn't exist. Now there was one in Utah with President Young and John Taylor, and he borrowed the term united order from the Doctrine and Covenants that he was using and applied it to the system that was established in Utah after the railroad came in order to counter a competition with the railroad. That's when ZSMI was established, and that's when the United Orders in Utah were established. They have nothing to do with the scriptures. They have nothing to do with the United Order of the scriptures of Missouri and Ohio. A word about abolition, and I will be short on that because I think the presentation has already been given quite adequately. In the 1950s, I left an institute class at the University of Utah after my teacher there, T.H. Lyon, had given a lesson on Joseph Smith's views of government when he was running for the President of the United States. You all know that, and one of the features of Joseph Smith's new proposition for candidacy was he was going to free the slaves. I thought that was a magnanimous thing for Joseph to do. I was a young man when I heard that, and I guess I left class maybe even expanding what was actually said there. But I thought the church, Joseph Smith, the early days, we were anti-slavists, we were pro-abolitionists. Joseph wanted to free the slaves and do away with that terrible tragedy in the American lifestyle. Shortly after that, I began my master's thesis, and in my master's thesis, The Conflict at Curlin, I realized the Saints had problems and conflict from day one to day at the end of their time in Curlin. One of the problems they had, and it was not a real big problem, it was a significant one, however, and that is the Mormons had political enemies. As you may know, the Latter-day Saints in Ohio were Jacksonian Democrats. They were anti-nationalists. They published a political newspaper in Curlin called the Northern Times. The political newspaper dealt with the issues of Martin Van Buren, who was the candidate for election at that time, and they also dealt with, that newspaper dealt with abolition movement in America. I want to just show you a page from my thesis. The newspaper, Northern Times, was a large newspaper of this sort, but I reduced it so it can appear on a page. And then I took from the second page this center piece, which I've superimposed upon the front page. The center piece reads, National Nomination, Martin Van Buren, New York, for President, and for Vice President, Richard M. Johnson. Well, I always thought we hated Martin Van Buren until I read the article and saw the advertisement in the Northern Times. But the reason I'm bringing this up is the next paragraph, abolition. Several communications have been sent to the Northern Times for insertion in favor of anti-slavery or the abolition of slavery. To prevent any misunderstanding on the subject, we positively say that with the matter, we are opposed to abolitionism and whatsoever is calculated to disturb the peace and harmony of our Constitution and country. Abolition does not hardly belong to law or religion, politics or gospel, according to our idea of things. Well, in reading that surprised me and countered my youthful interpretation of what the teacher was trying to put across at the Salt Lake Institute lesson I had referred to before. In the document, that is the letter that Joseph wrote to Oliver Cowdery about abolition that Brother Heimberger referred to. In that same publication of the Northern Times, there were two other editorials or letters about the same subject, and then the following month there was a fourth one. I bring this up now only because I thought when I did my master's thesis that this subject would eventually be picked up by some scholar somewhere and deal with the very roots of the Mormon and black issue in the church. It did not. Whenever I heard a speaker talk about early Mormon history, they always quoted the Nauvoo, Joseph was going to free the slaves. They never referred to the Kirtland abolitionist position of the church, anti-abolitionist position of the church. And I was in hopes that somewhere somebody would put those editorials together and examine the subject of why the blacks did not hold the priesthood from those early attitudes, from those early editorials I referred to. No one has ever done that, and so consequently I wrote another study, one for BYU Studies, where I published again the same page, and the BYU article I thought would get more circulation. It did not, apparently, and nobody has ever addressed that issue of sifting through the details of the problems of the church would face if they did not object to abolitionism in Kirtland. We had missionaries in Kentucky and Tennessee at the time, and Joseph Smith was a very practical man and realized that if the Southerners ever got the hint that the Mormons were abolitionists, our missionaries in Kentucky and Tennessee would be tarred and feathered and driven out of the states. And our members there, we had about 130 members in the counties in those two states, they would be blackballed and would have difficulty too. So Joseph Smith took a very strong position against abolitionism in this editorial and in the other editorials that I mentioned that were included in the Messenger and Advocate that month. Joseph was pragmatic, and in his letter to Oliver Cowdery, he emphatically declares, using the Old Testament, the New Testament, and quoting passage of Scripture after passage of Scripture to show the purpose why the blacks were slaves in America was because of the hand of God. And that they were right where God wanted them, and we should respond to that. That position, I think, should be examined very carefully, along with the other editorials that I mentioned, and then with what other material might be available to help us to tease out more detail in the step-by-step development of the Mormons, the blacks, and the priesthood. I think there's something there to be said. I didn't write that article because I was an employee of the church, and I knew that there might be problems, and so I simply made those introductions and invitations with those articles. Now, the third subject that I'd like to address, and I'll do that quickly and finish up, and that is the night before Joseph Smith left Kirtland. It is January the 12th, 1838. They had a terrible problem with apostasy in Kirtland. Christine mentioned, of course, there were 28 leaders that were excommunicated in the late fall of 1837. The dissidents were going to organize a new church. Out in Missouri, Joseph had just returned from Caldwell County, Missouri, and he had recognized that the Mormons would be gathering out there, building new communities. Large numbers would eventually gather together and so forth, and so he became very much concerned about a problem. And that problem was, what if the dissidents tried to organize a stake of Zion after they were apostatized from the church or excommunicated from the church? And then there's an issue out in Missouri. David Whitmer, as you may know, in 1834 had been ordained by Joseph Smith to be his successor. He was known throughout the history as David Whitmer, president of the church in Zion, or president of the church in Missouri. He felt that he was president of the church in Missouri, Joseph was president of the church in Ohio. And whatever Joseph can do in Ohio, I can do in Missouri was kind of an attitude. That belief that he was the successor of Joseph Smith carried with him and with the family over the years. Now, although he was ordained by Joseph, his successor, in July of 1834, when Zion's camp was in Missouri, we know that the true successor was, of course, Oliver Cowdery. Aldrich Cowdery was always designated as the successor, but at this time, in 1834, he was out of favor with the prophet Joseph. And after Joseph returned to Kirtland from Zion's camps to visit in Clay County, then he ordained Aldrich Cowdery as his successor. So there was never any problem on that, but the David Whitmer family carried this idea that he indeed was to be Joseph Smith's successor down to the 1838 period of time. Consequently, Joseph may have been concerned that David Whitmer would organize stakes as the saints gathered in Upper Missouri. So, we have now the introduction to the three missing Kirtland revelations. The reason I call them missing revelations is for this reason. After I did my master's thesis, I'm reading in the History of the Church, Volume 3, page 40. The date is July the 8th, 1838. Joseph is in Far West, and he records this in his journal. The three revelations which I received January the 12th, 1838, the day I left Kirtland, were read in the public congregation at Far West. Footnote by B.H. Roberts reads accordingly. The three revelations here referred to do not appear in the Doctrine and Covenants, nor in any other publication of the church. Diligent search also has been made for them throughout the several packages of church documents in the historian's office, but they have never been found. So I call them the three missing Kirtland revelations. The night of January the 12th, 1838, Joseph has visited his mother and father are there in the home. He actually is in his own home. His home is located just a few doors north of the temple. There's the temple, then there's the Methodist church, and then there's the cemetery, then a couple of lots, and then Joseph Smith's house. It's in that house that he is visiting with his parents and visiting with others. That evening, then, he receives three revelations. Those revelations, I will do a little more than simply identify what they are and what they do, and then complete my comments. The first of the revelations dealt with the question, who has the authority to judge or to try a presidency of the church? That's on Joseph's mind. They have apostates. They may organize. We have difficulty in Missouri. They may organize. Who has the authority to hold a court to try a member of the First Presidency? Section 107 answers that, in part at least, where it says that the bishop, or the person's bishop, and in this case, Kirtland, the bishop there was Newell K. Whitney. There is no such thing as a presiding bishop in the church at this time. There's two bishops, one in Kirtland, one in Missouri. The bishop shall call 12 high priests, and they shall then try a member of the First Presidency. So this revelation is really an inquiry about more information about that passage in section 107. The revelation is presented by the prophet Joseph in the form of questions, who then has the authority to try a member of the First Presidency, and then an answer. It's a little bit involved, and I'll make it very brief and try to make it simple. The basic idea was that one stake of the church, that is Kirtland stake or Missouri stake, one stake of the church does not have the authority to try or to excommunicate a member of the First Presidency. If the stake in Zion, that is the Missouri stake under David Whitmer's leadership, if that stake were to try a member of the First Presidency, that stake would not have the authority either, unless the stake in Zion presented the case to the other stakes of the church. There's only one other one at this time, but if there were others, those two, to present their conclusion and their evidence to other stakes of Zion, and if those other stakes of Zion then approved, then the prophet would be, or the member of the First Presidency would be excommunicated. So it deals with that issue. In other words, any one stake of the church cannot try and excommunicate the president of the church or his counselors. Another issue of that revelation was they had to have appropriate and worthy witnesses, free witnesses, to verify or speak against those on trial. That was revelation number 1. Revelation number 2 was who could organize a stake in the church. And this declaration, without reading the quote here to you, says that only the first presidency can organize stakes. Now that's the way we've always functioned, but we didn't have the revelation canonized to reinforce that point of view. We now have it, at least in the Joseph Smith Papers, though it's not canonized, but that principle has been, as I understand it, always the principle in the church in the past. The first presidency alone, no one else can establish a stake. And then the third revelation that he received that evening was a declaration by the Lord to Joseph and his family to get out of Kirtland, to flee Kirtland. Joseph was under all kinds of difficulty with the apostates in Kirtland. He was also under charge of illegal banking. The sheriff was out with a warrant for Joseph Smith's arrest that night, according to Apostle Johnson, Luke Johnson. And Luke Johnson, knowing that, intervened in behalf of Joseph Smith so he could get away without being arrested there in Kirtland. So he responds to the revelation, get out of town. He flees that night with Sidney Rigdon. They're on their way to far west Missouri. These are great documents. They are, I think, worth reading and examining, and especially the notes, the footnotes, and the introduction gives the reader a great insight into the context as to their meaning and as to the historical setting that produced them. I would recommend them to all of us to read. Thank you.
And when I come up, we'll have some questions. Do you want to? I don't want to be. Just field those. I won't get in the way. But I hope you've stored up some questions. It won't surprise you to agree with me, or I think you would agree with me in that the collective knowledge here is pretty amazing. It's not. We've just got the smallest amount of that, but that was wonderful. So, how about it, you guys? Raise your hand. We'll.
Do you find, as the Joseph Smith Papers has now been going for a while, you pretty much found everything, or you're stumbling on new things all the time, or what do you think?
Can you hear that back there? Will you repeat? Somebody.
So he asked if, as we go through the Joseph Smith Papers, if we stumble across new things, or if we, pretty much already, got everything. And I think with each volume, I mean, if you're speaking about in terms of Joseph Smith documents, we occasionally find new ones here and there, particularly as new newspapers become available to us through digitization efforts across the country. We get a few new documents here and there, but what we really find, I think, that is new as we go through the research of each document and each volume is new ways to understand and contextualize, and we have other journals that Latter-day Saints or even not Latter-day Saints of the period who interacted with members of the church have written letters. Elizabeth just showed me a few weeks ago a letter from a young woman in Kirtland writing to one of her relatives about the Parley P. Pratt and Orson Pratt kind of fallout. And when I mentioned this to Matt Groh, who is a biographer of Parley P. Pratt, he said he'd never seen this before. And so it's things like that that we find, I think, more contextual understanding of the documents than we would say we find new Joseph Smith documents, although we are finding some here and there as we go along. So I'm sure that will continue over the next 5 to 7 years. Derek, did you have a question?
I was going to say, Christian, you mentioned how you enjoyed coming across things that kind of revealed, you know, the human and transparent side of Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, are there any other, and this could be for anybody as well, any other kind of gems that you came across that gave you kind of a greater sense for Joseph's just, I guess, natural self, if you will, that were, I guess, just eye-opening to you, or something you enjoyed just learning about him? So.
Yeah, I mean, Safety Society documents, things like that.
The bank is eye-opening in a lot of ways. We don't have a lot that Joseph's actually commenting on. And actually one of the ways that I think maybe all three of us got some insights into Joseph. Emma writes letters to Joseph in the spring of 1837, and they're in Documents Volume 5. And they kind of speak to both their relationship as well as kind of the larger problems that Kirtland is facing at that point. And I think you can see her trying to communicate the financial difficulties, the worries about their family, even as kind of minute as one of the boarders in the area has measles, and she's already lost a child to measles. So this is very much on her mind. I think with The Descent, we have a really rare chance to get some kind of emotional context. There are a couple of 1837 letters that we rely on heavily for annotation, written by Mary Fielding Valette Kimball, and one by Hepzibah Richards, the sister of Willard Richards. These aren't in the volume because they aren't addressed to Joseph Smith, but we cite from them quite a bit, and they kind of give us an emotional side of what the Descent means, whether it's Joseph getting up before a congregation and kind of being overwhelmed by all that's going on, or the fact that there is such disunity, that this community is really torn apart, and that's one thing that he's trying to grapple with as its leader.
And I would say too, in the build-up, as Joseph Smith is preparing members of the church as well as members of the 12 to receive the endowment of power, and before the, or excuse me, after the temple dedication, a lot of the interactions that he has with the apostles are quite. I mean, who knew that meeting minutes would be that exciting, right? But he has interactions with them that are actually quite. I don't want to say tender is maybe the wrong way to characterize it, but he's speaking to them as brothers in a lot of ways, and there have been some disunity amongst them in certain places in the volume that we talk about, but there's a really poignant meeting in which he gets up and tells them, if I've offended you in any way, I apologize, I've done it out of love, and so I think that's one that stands out to me that really humanizes Joseph Smith.
I would just add, if you were to read through kind of the whole of the documents, the things that stood out to me are the complexities of Joseph Smith. He's a very complex individual that you see come through in the pages of these documents, and being okay with his complexities and learning to embrace that side of, all humans are complex, right? And that's something that's usually, but you also have at points a scarcity of not, we don't know exactly where Joseph Smith is at times or why he goes somewhere, or some of the things that he does, and the documents just are silent. And that's kind of one of the things that is both aggravating and beautiful about history, is that you have to, again, be okay with not knowing. And in our volumes we don't go on and speculate on those things, and try to stay very grounded in the documentary record. And so you can know what the documents say about who Joseph Smith is and where he is.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Would you please summarize the methods that you use from the time that you receive an old document and put on those white gloves and begin to turn the pages as they crackle until you have the finished product that we know to be the Joseph Smith papers? And will you compare that method with similar methods, if they are similar, that are used by the larger historic community, historians in Washington, D.C., who review American history generally, not necessarily Mormon history, but all American history, and if you could broaden it even further, how that compares to world history writers and world historians?
May I make an initial comment on that, and then you can pick it up and carry it further. Alex Baugh and I were the two original historians assigned to check the documents. First of all, the documents would be turned over to a secretary who would produce a typescript. Alex and I then had those typescripts, and we had to compare the typescripts with the original document in terms of every accuracy aspect of it. The spelling, the grammar, everything in the typescript had to perfectly represent the manuscript in a communicatable way. Once we did that, then we took those typescripts, which had been verified for accuracy, and wrote an introductory historical setting for each of the documents, including footnotes. Then we turned all of those over to these brethren and sister to pick it up from there.
Well, our method, I guess, in a newer iteration of the project from the one that Max and Alex were really integral to, relies on essentially a database. And as Max said, we essentially get transcripts of these original old documents. Generally, these are done by volunteers. Some of our amazing missionaries that work at the Church History Library do a lot of this initial transcription for us. And then we have a web team that will be responsible for kind of that comparative level. And then at the third level, we have kind of the individual volume editors are responsible for doing those kind of last stages of verification and making sure that every period and comma and misspelled word is represented. And then from those transcripts, we build contextual annotation and historical introductions that you see in the volumes. And this process is documentary editing. It's not the historian's craft. As such, of course, historians were involved in this. But in terms of comparative approaches to other projects, there's quite a few Founding Fathers documentary editions that are out there. The Adams Papers is a particularly prominent one and has a very long series. And they follow similar roles of kind of doing these levels of transcription and then providing introductions. I think in terms of kind of American history and world history, we do tend towards heavier annotation than many projects. We try and be more informative as we try and balance both of our academic readers and kind of our lay Mormon readers that might need a little bit more context. Anything to add?
I would just add that we're all trained at the highest levels, national standards for documentary editing and historical research, both through education in university settings as well as continuing education, attending trainings like the Association for Documentary Editing's Camp Edit, which teaches these national standards, and we've applied that to the papers as a whole. The papers are branded and approved by the National Publications, what is it, NHPRC, National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and so we adhere to the highest national standards for the type of work that we do, and we're all trained in those standards.
I'll just add one thing to that. As you know, as you've read, or perhaps read, the History of the Church by Joseph Smith, sometimes spoken of as a documentary history, that history, of course, contains many of the documents that are in the Joseph Smith papers, very many of them. However, Roberts or somebody else, in many cases, highly edited some of those documents in the History of the Church. To use the word transparency today is appropriate for that to be applied to the Joseph Smith Papers documents because they have not been edited. There are no dots and no deletions. They are transparently as honest as we could possibly make them in terms of their original content. I think that's very important to know. That's not true with the History of the Church by Joseph Smith.
And I want to add something too. My understanding is that from the beginning of this whole papers project that as those who had worked on some of the nationally prominent papers like Founding Fathers, they were extremely impressed with what the editors and all those who were working on the Joseph Smith papers were producing, the quality of the scholarship, the workmanship, and the actual production of the books. And while they may do a few hundred sets of papers, publish them on some of these on a national level, the numbers of the Joseph Smith volumes dwarf those numbers. I mean, the very first one, I can't even remember, but tens of thousands of copies were sold. In fact, they had to kind of back off because they were so successful in the sales of the early volumes that it made some people nervous because they didn't want church members to feel obligated to buy them, or they didn't want it to be too commercial, but they were sort of victims of their own success. But by comparison, the Joseph Smith papers not only stand up well against national equivalents, but actually surpass them in many ways. So they have every right to be proud of what they produced.
I was going to say, for the full description of that, I remember reading in the introduction of Journals Volume 1, and it talks ad nauseum about the editorial process, and like after a few paragraphs and it's pages long, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, you win, I just believe you. Because it was like, nerd alerts were going off in my mind like crazy. I couldn't believe how strict it was, the process they used. So
I object to ad nauseum.
it's a lot.
Pretty close, okay, for one who knows. Any other questions? We're running a little late, but if there's, okay. Thank you so much. Let's give them another hand.